Thanks for watching this X-Men video tutorial on Sony Vegas. In this episode, we're talking about frame rates. Now, this will not be a full, exhaustive, drawn-out lecture on frame rates. I'm just going to go over the bare essentials. So here's what we'll cover. Finding what your video's frame rate is, how to change your project settings to match your video's frame rate and why that's important, and when you should be using what frame rate. But first we'll go over what frame rate is and which ones are the most common. But before I get started, you should know I'm not going to cover the difference between I and P on this tutorial. You'll notice frame rates are always listed with an I or a P next to the rate. For that, you'll want to watch the next tutorial on deinterlacing. Alright, so let's get started. Frame rates are how many images occur per second in your video as it plays. So if we zoom in on our timeline, we'll be able to see this timeline is set up at 30 frames per second. Each one of these notches marks where one image is. If you wanted to count them, you would find that there are in fact 30 notches. 30 frames a second is the most common in our digital age. Previously, film was at 24 frames a second, so 30 and 24 frames per second are going to be the most common. And when I say 30, it's technically 29.97 frames per second, but it's just easier to round up and say 30. But be careful, because if you are editing a 29.97 video on an exact 30.00 FPS timeline, you may experience some audio sync issues. Then there's 60 frames per second, or 59.94, which is often used for shots with a lot of fast motion, like sporting events. And then 120 frames per second is the most common rate used to create high-quality slow-motion videos. So how do you find what frame rate your video is? Simply go to the properties of the video file. I use PC, so you'll have to translate this if you're on a Mac, but just right-click on the video and select the properties. Go over to the Details tab where you'll find frame rate, and you'll see this one is 29, which means 29.97. Another way is if your video is already inside Sony Vegas, just right-click on the video in the project media and select Properties. Go over to the General tab where you'll find the frames per second listed in this Streams section. Now let's cover how to change your project settings to match your video's frame rate, and why that's important. Now that you know your frame rate is 30 or 29.97, it's important to make sure your project timeline matches so you don't run into any blurry or stuttering video upon playback. Also, this will keep your audio in sync with your video. So simply go to File and Properties, and here in this frame rate box, select the rate that matches your video. If you have an odd video frame rate that you don't see listed here, for example, webinar videos are often recorded at lower frame rates like 10 or even sometimes 5. Just go right ahead and type in the number that matches your video's rate. And voila, your project timeline is now the same as your video. So finally, let's talk about when to use what frame rate. Low frame rates like 5 and 10 are what you'll want to use when your video has minimal movement. Webinars and stagnant slideshows work well at this 5 to 10 frame rate because there is no movement on the webinar slide or the images that make up the slideshow. Also, your final file size will be much smaller at these lower frame rates. General videos that you'll be adding text motion or any other kind of graphic animation to, you'll want to use 29.97, so your animations will come out nice and smooth. 60 or 59.94 is good for when you've got a lot of fast motion, or if you're going to be manipulating the playback of a video to create a slow motion effect. We'll show you how to do that in a later tutorial. That covers the basics on frame rates. Keep checking back for more, and don't forget to subscribe and share. Thanks for watching.